The bucket slipped from Nora Blake's hands at the worst possible moment. Water crashed across the courtyard stones and spread in a wide, cold sheet over a pair of black riding boots. The boots belonged to the Alpha King. Everything stopped. The blacksmith's hammer stopped. The horses stopped shifting. 40 wolves of Ironcrest Hold stood frozen in the winter light, and every single one of them turned to look at the thin girl kneeling in a puddle at the feet of the most powerful man in the north. Nora did not breathe. She had spent 11 years learning how to be invisible, and she had just failed at it in front of the entire world. Edward Hale, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, looked down at his ruined boots. He did not shout. That was the frightening part. Men who shouted were finished quickly. Edward Hale simply looked, and the silence stretched until it hurt. "What is this?" he asked. Alpha Gregory Marsh, master of Ironcrest, hurried forward with his hands out. "A servant, my king. Nothing more. An orphan we took in out of kindness. She is slow in the head." Nora kept her eyes on the stones. She was not slow. She could read 4 languages, though no one had ever taught her, and she could name every star above the hold. She had simply learned, very early, that a girl with no family and no rank was safest when she said nothing at all. "Look at me," Edward said. She did not want to. She did it anyway, because there was no choice, and for one strange second, the courtyard tilted under her. He was younger than the stories made him sound. Dark hair, a jaw like a closed door, and eyes the gray of a frozen lake. Behind him stood his war banners, and his warriors and his warlord, and none of that was what struck her. What struck her was that when their eyes met, something inside her chest turned over like a sleeping animal rolling in its den. Edward felt it too. She saw the flicker cross his face. She saw him decide, in the space of half a heartbeat, that he did not like it. "Some creatures," he said, loud enough for the whole yard, "are born without enough soul to be worth naming. The moon must have been looking somewhere else the night this one was made." The courtyard laughed. It rolled through the crowd like a wave, warriors and servants, and the daughters of noble houses, all of them laughing at a girl on her knees in cold water. The loudest laugh belonged to Diana Frost, who stood at the top of the steps in silver-gray wool, with her hair braided like a crown, because everyone in Ironcrest already knew who the king had come to choose. Nora did not cry. She had stopped crying at 9 years old, the way a person stops using a door that always sticks. She gathered the fallen bucket. She wiped the king's boots with the hem of her own sleeve, slowly and carefully, and when she was finished, she stood, bowed her head, and walked away without a single word. Edward Hale watched her go, and could not have explained, under any pressure in the world, why his own wolf was pacing inside him, whining like a pup at a shut gate. The king had come for the choosing. It was an old custom, 300 years old at least, and the northern packs treated it like a festival. Every 10 years, the Alpha King rode out and took a bride from among the border holds, and in exchange, those holds gained his protection, his grain in bad winters, and his warriors on their walls. It was a fair trade on paper. In practice, it meant the daughters of powerful houses were dressed like prizes and lined up like horses at market, and everyone pretended to be delighted about it. Diana Frost had been preparing for this since she was 12. The hold turned itself inside out. Banners were hung. The great hall was scrubbed until it shone, and Nora Blake was sent down to the scullery with the clear instruction that she was not to be seen above stairs again while the king was under the roof. She did not mind the work. She minded the noise. From below, she could hear the feast starting, the stamping, the songs, the laughter, and every burst of it felt like a small stone thrown at her back. Old Martha Doyle found her there near midnight, elbow deep in gray water. Martha was the hearthkeeper, ancient and completely blind, and she moved through Ironcrest as if the walls politely stepped aside for her. She had never once treated Nora like a fool. "They hurt you today," Martha said. It was not a question. Nora shrugged, which was wasted on a blind woman, and then remembered and said quietly, "It does not matter." Martha's head came up sharply. "There," the old woman said. "Say that again." "Say what?" "Anything, girl. Say anything at all." Nora put down the pot. "Martha, I am tired." The old woman reached out and found her wrist with startling accuracy, and her grip was tighter than any grandmother's should be. "Listen to me," Martha said. and her voice had dropped so low it was barely air. "Tonight, of all the nights of your life, do not go near the hollow. Do not walk that way. Do not stand on that ground. And whatever you feel like doing when the hurt gets too big to hold, do not raise your voice out there. Promise me." "Nobody goes to the hollow," Nora said. "Nothing grows there. Even the crows go around it." "That is not why nobody goes." Martha let go of her. "Promise me." Nora promised. She meant it too, for about 3 hours. It broke at the well. She had gone up for water because the scullery cistern was empty, keeping to the shadows the way she always did, and she almost made it. She was 6 steps from the door when Diana Frost came around the corner with 2 of her friends, all of them warm with wine and pleased with the evening. "There she is," Diana said. "The famous one. Do you know they are still talking about you inside? The king made a joke about your soul. It was very funny." Nora tried to step around her. Diana moved into her path, still smiling, and knocked the full bucket out of her hands for the 2nd time that day. Water went everywhere. The other 2 laughed. "Now you can do it again," Diana said pleasantly. "You seem to enjoy it." And something in Nora Blake, which had been folded down small and packed away since she was 7 years old, quietly came loose. She did not shout. She did not swing. She looked Diana Frost in the eye for exactly as long as she wanted to, which was longer than a servant is ever allowed, and then she turned and walked out of the gate into the dark. The guards did not stop her. Why would they? Nobody worried about the quiet one. She walked north, past the barley fields, past the last of the trees, and out onto the wide, bare ground the old maps called the Hollow. Nothing grew there. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not grass, not thorn, not moss. It was a great shallow bowl of dark stone and thin gray soil, ringed by dead ground, and the snow that fell on it never seemed to settle properly. Wolves would not hunt there. Horses refused it. Children were told it swallowed people, which was the sort of story adults invent when the truth has been lost. Nora stood in the middle of it, with her hands in fists at her sides, and her breath steaming in the freezing air, and she felt the entire weight of 11 years pressed down on her shoulders at once. 11 years of scrubbing, 11 years of being stepped over, 11 years of a name nobody bothered to learn, in a place where nobody had ever once said her name kindly. She thought of the laughter in the courtyard. She thought of the way the king had looked at her, and then decided out loud that she was worth nothing. And she opened her mouth, alone in the dark where no one could hear her, and she finally said the thing she had never let herself say. "I am here." 3 words. That was all. The ground answered. It did not shake. It did not crack. Something far, far beneath her feet drew a long breath, the way a sleeper does when a familiar voice reaches them in a dream, and then a howl came up through the stone. It was not a sound a living throat could make. It rolled up out of the earth and through the soles of her boots and up her spine and out into the night sky. And it went on, low and vast and impossibly old. A note that had been waiting under that ground since before there were words for anything. Nora did not run. She stood in the center of the hollow with tears freezing on her face and her heart beating hard enough to hurt, and she understood one thing with perfect clarity. It had answered her. Behind her, a mile away, Ironcrest Hold came apart. Every wolf inside those walls woke at once. Warriors fell out of their beds. Hounds screamed. Horses kicked their stalls to splinters and ran. Grown men, who had faced armies without blinking, found themselves on the floor of the great hall, with their arms over their heads, shaking, and not one of them could say why. Alpha Gregory Marsh crawled under his own high table. And in the tower room above them all, Edward Hale stood at the window with his hands braced on the stone, staring north into the dark. His wolf, which had never bowed to anything in 29 years of life, which had faced down 4 rival kings and a rebellion, and had never once given ground, had dropped flat inside him. Belly down, ears back, utterly still. It was not fear. He knew fear. This was something older and far worse. It was recognition. "My king." Simon Crane came through the door without knocking, and the warlord's face was the color of ash. He was a big man, silver at the temples, 48 years old and calm through every battle Edward had ever fought at his side. He was not calm now. "You heard it." "Everyone heard it," Edward said. "No. Crane crossed the room fast. Everyone heard a noise. I am asking if you heard it. Edward turned. In all the years Simon Crane had raised him, advised him, and stood at his right hand, since he was a boy of 9, on a throne too large for him, Edward had never seen that look on the man's face. Simon Crane was afraid. What is out there? Edward asked quietly. Nothing, said Crane, nothing at all. It is dead ground and old superstition. He was already reaching for the door. But I want that ground burned to the rock by spring, every stone of it. I want it broken and salted and forgotten, and I want it done before the thaw. He left. Edward stayed at the window until the sky turned gray. At dawn, a shepherd came running to the gates with a story nobody wanted to believe, so half the hold went out to look for themselves. The hollow was covered in a hard shell of frost, unbroken and silver, stretching a quarter-mile in every direction. And through the middle of it ran a line of bare, thawed footprints, small and narrow, and clearly a woman's, leading to the center and stopping. Around them, in a perfect ring, the frozen ground had cracked open from underneath. Something down there was digging its way up. They came for Nora before the frost had melted off the gateposts. 4 warriors dragged her out of the scullery in front of everyone, and she did not fight, because fighting was for people who had somewhere to fall back to. They marched her up the steps and into the great hall, where Alpha Gregory Marsh sat with his hands gripping the arms of his chair, and where the Alpha King stood by the fire with his back to the room. The footprints match her feet, Marsh said. He had had them measured. He had been very thorough for a man who had spent the night under a table. She was seen leaving through the north gate. She was gone 4 hours. She came back with dirt on her hands, and she did not explain herself. I did not know I was required to, Nora said. The hall went quiet. It was the first full sentence most of them had ever heard from her. Marsh flushed dark red. She has brought something down on us. Whatever woke last night, she woke it, and it will come for this hold. Hold while she stands inside these walls. Diana Frost, seated near the front in fresh silver wool, spoke up in a voice full of soft concern. There have always been stories about her, that she was found on the dead ground as a baby, that she was left there on purpose, because whoever left her knew what she was. That part, at least, was true, and Nora had never once been told it. She turned her head slowly and looked at Diana, and Diana looked away first. Edward Hale had not moved from the fire. He had not spoken since they brought her in. He was standing with one hand flat on the mantel, and he was not thinking about justice. He was thinking about the fact that the moment she was pushed through the door, the thing inside him had stood straight up. Send her out, Marsh said. Out onto the hollow, since she likes it there so much. If the ground wants her, it can have her. There was no argument, because there was no one in that hall who cared enough to make one. Except one voice, from the back, cracked and furious. You fools, Martha Doyle said. You blind, comfortable fools. You have no idea what you are throwing away. They put the old woman out of the hall, and they put the girl out of the gate. They gave her a blanket, a heel of bread, and a small clay jar of water, and every person watching understood that this was a death sentence with good manners. Nobody survived a northern night on open ground. That was simply a fact, like snow being cold. Nora walked out into the white without looking back, and the gates shut behind her with a sound like a book closing. She lasted until the light started to go. By then her feet had stopped hurting, which she understood was a bad sign, and the wind had come up out of the north and was pushing her sideways. The bread was gone. The water in the jar had frozen into a lump she could not break. She was somewhere near the middle of the hollow, or she thought she was, though the snow had erased every landmark, and she was no longer certain which way the hold lay. She went down onto one knee, and then onto both. All right, she said to the ground, and her voice came out cracked and small. You answered me last night, so answer me now, or let me be finished. The hollow opened, not violently, not the way the earth breaks in a quake. 10 paces in front of her, the snow simply slid away in a long, clean line, as though a hand had drawn a finger through it, and underneath was black stone, and set into the black stone were steps going down. Nora looked at them for a long moment. Then she laughed, once, a strange raw sound, and she went down. The wind cut off behind her as if a door had shut. The cold went with it. 20 steps down, the air turned still and dry, and faintly warm, and she could smell stone and old smoke, and something else she had no name for. The stair opened into a bowl of a chamber, wider than the great hall at Ironcrest, roofed with rock she could not see the top of. And standing in it, in a perfect circle, were 9 mounds of black stone. They were the size of houses. Each one was ringed with a low wall, and each low wall was carved with letters, and each mound had a doorway of sorts, sealed shut with a single slab that had been fitted so precisely that no light showed at the edge. 8 of the doors were closed. The 9th had a crack in it, running from top to bottom, and dark earth was heaped in front of it, where something had pushed from the inside. Nora walked along the carvings, with her fingers trailing on the stone. She should not have been able to read them. They were nothing like the letters in the Hold's ledgers, nothing like the trade script or the old prayers. They were angular and deep and strange. She read them anyway, as easily as she read her own name. Here lie the first. Here lie the 9. They came when called, and they weighed us, and we did not like what the scale said, so we buried the scale. Well, said a voice behind her, you found it faster than I did, and I had 50 years. Nora spun. Martha Doyle stood at the bottom of the stair with a pack on her shoulder and snow melting in her white hair, breathing hard, one hand against the wall. You are blind, Nora said stupidly. You are blind, and you are 70 years old, and you walked out here in that. I have walked to this place in my head every night since I was 20, Martha said. My feet only had to catch up. She lowered herself onto the bottom step and let the pack fall. Sit down, girl. There is a great deal you were never told, and we have one night to fix 11 years. So Nora sat on the floor of a buried hall between 9 stone mounds and learned who she was. Before the packs had kings, Martha said, there were the 9, the first wolves. They were not born the way we are born. The stories say they came down out of the high country when the world was young, and that they were bigger than any beast now living, and older than the idea of counting. Were they monsters? That is what the histories say. The histories were written by the men who buried them. Martha's blind eyes turned toward the mounds as if she could see them perfectly well. They were not monsters. They were judges. Nora went still. They came when they were called, Martha said. Not to a crown, not to strength, not to blood. They came to a voice. And when they came, they looked into whoever had called them, and into whoever stood accused, and they saw the truth of it, all of it, every hidden thing, and they said so out loud in front of everyone. And people hated that. Kings hated that. The old woman's mouth twisted. A judge you cannot bribe or frighten or marry into your family is not a tool. It is a threat. So 9 of the great houses came together, and they made a promise of peace, and they invited the 9 down into a hall carved specially for the celebration. Nora looked at the sealed slabs and felt cold all over. They sealed them in, she said. They sealed them in, and they wrote the histories to say the 9 were beasts and had to be put down, and for 300 years, no wolf has walked on this ground, because we were all told a story about swallowed children. Martha reached out and found Nora's hand. But a lock needs a key. The 9 only ever woke for a voice, so the houses had to make certain no such voice was ever born again. The bloodline, Nora said. We called them the moon speakers. A word from one of them could wake the 9. Only one word. There were never many, and they married quietly, and they lived in the border villages, and mostly minded their own business for 3 centuries. What happened to them? Martha's hand tightened. 21 years ago, there was a winter, she said. And in that winter, every Moonspeaker family in the northern reaches died. All of them, inside 9 days. The Crown recorded it as sickness. There was no sickness. I know because I was hearthkeeper at Ironcrest that year, and I saw riders come through in the night wearing no colors, and I heard a young woman at our gate begging for shelter with a baby wrapped in her cloak, and I heard the master of this hold refuse her, and I heard her walk away north onto ground where riders would not follow. Nora could not speak. She left you where the 9 could hear you if it ever came to it, Martha said gently. She died out there on that stone so that you would not, and I have been listening for your voice ever since, girl. And last night, at long last, I heard it. Nora sat with her back against 300 years of black stone and cried for a mother she could not remember, and the buried hall let her do it without complaint. Far to the south, the Alpha King's kingdom was coming apart at the seams. The reports arrived at Ironcrest 2 at a time, then 4, Then in a steady, miserable stream. The Ravenmoor packs had come down out of the eastern hills and were taking the border holds one after another. Granaries emptied, roads cut. 2 of Edward's garrisons had been surrounded and forced to yield in a single week. Edward stood over the map table until his eyes ached, and what bothered him was not that he was losing. It was that the losses made no sense. "Look at it," he said, dragging a finger across the pins. "They take Redwater and hold it. They take Ashford and walk away. They cut the northern road but leave the southern one open, which is the road my grain moves on. That is not an army feeding itself. That is an army spelling something out." "It is an army of savages," Simon Crane said. "You are looking for cleverness where there is only hunger. Ravenmoor has fought me twice in 9 years, and never once got past the river. Now they take 4 holds in 11 days. Edward looked up. Who is leading them? Does it matter? It matters a great deal. Crane spread his hands, calm and warm and entirely reasonable, the way he had been since Edward was a boy of 9, sitting on a throne with his feet not reaching the floor. What matters is that you are standing in a drafty border hold, worrying about ghosts under a field, while your kingdom burns. Choose the Frost Girl. Bind the North. Ride south and finish this. And there it was again, Edward thought. Every conversation, no matter where it started, was steered back toward that same dead patch of ground, and away from it, the way a man steers a horse past something it must not see. "You want the hollow burned?" Edward said slowly. "I want you safe. You have never in your life used that word about me." Crane's smile did not move. "Then let me say it plainly. Whatever howled under that field, it did not howl for you. There is no place in a kingdom for a power that does not answer to the throne. Burn it, and you will never have to find out what it answers to instead." That night, for the 4th night running, Edward Hale did not sleep. His wolf would not settle. It had not settled since the courtyard, and it had turned unbearable since they put the girl out of the gate. It paced. It turned toward the north wall of the room and stared. Twice he had woken on his feet, hand on the door, with no memory of getting up. He kept seeing her wiping his boots with her own sleeve. He kept hearing 40 people laugh, and himself starting it. He had said worse things to better people, and slept perfectly well. He did not understand why this one sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. On the 5th morning, without telling Crane, without taking a guard, he saddled his horse and rode north. He found the hollow, under a hard blue sky, and it was completely changed. The snow was gone. Not melted, gone, as if it had been peeled back, and the bare black stone of the bowl was showing for the first time in living memory, and it was carved. The whole floor of the hollow was one enormous ring of letters, running from edge to edge, a mile of writing that no living scholar could have read. In the center of it, a stair went down into the earth, and at the top of that stair, standing in a plain torn dress with her feet bare on freezing rock, was the servant girl he had thrown away. She was not alone. Edward's horse locked its legs and refused to take another step, and after a moment it simply lay down in the stone, and Edward stepped off it and did not blame it in the least. The thing beside her had come up out of the dark, and it was still coming, shoulder after shoulder after shoulder, until it stood clear in the daylight. It was a wolf. It was the size of a barn. Its fur was the color of storm cloud and old iron, and there were scars on it, shaped like the marks of chains, and its head was lowered, and its enormous eyes, which held something patient and terrible and awake, were fixed on nothing in the world except the thin girl standing under its jaw. Nora Blake reached up with both hands, and the oldest living thing in the north lowered its head into them like a hound coming home. The wolf's name arrived in Edward's head without passing through his ears. Corin. It was not a voice. It was more like remembering something he had never known, a fact placed carefully into his mind by something that had no interest in whether he wanted it. Edward Hale had commanded armies since he was 17. He had faced a rival king across a river, with 200 men against 900, and had not blinked. So he did the only thing his body knew how to do, and he pulled his shoulders back, and he spoke in the voice that had never once failed to be obeyed. "Stand down." The great head turned. Corin looked at him. That was all. There was no growl, no bared teeth, no threat of any kind, and that was somehow far worse, because a threat would have meant he counted for something. The ancient eyes moved over him, the way a man's eyes move over a chair, and Edward felt every single thing he had ever done laid out flat and red from beginning to end in the space of 2 heartbeats. Then his knees hit the stone. He did not decide to kneel. His body did it, all at once, and stayed down. He could feel his own wolf pressed flat inside him with its face hidden. "Get up," Nora said. He got up. They stared at each other across 10 feet of carved black rock, the girl who had been thrown out to freeze, and the king who had let it happen, and neither of them had the first idea what to say. "He will not hurt you," she said at last. "He does not think you are worth the effort." "That is fair." "It is not fair. It is just true." She wrapped her arms around herself, and he noticed her feet again, bare and blue on the freezing ground, and something in his chest twisted so hard he had to look away. He unfastened his cloak and held it out. Nora looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it, because she was cold and not stupid, and she put it on, and she did not thank him. "Come back with me," Edward said. "So you can hang me for waking it? So I can find out what I am standing on." He gestured at the mile of writing under their feet. "Whatever this is, it is in my kingdom. And whatever you are, half the North heard it 5 nights ago, and every one of them is frightened. I would rather have you where I can talk to you. That is not an apology." "No," he said, "it is not." She almost smiled, and it changed her whole face, and Edward Hale looked at her properly for the first time, and understood, with total and unwelcome clarity, exactly what his wolf had been trying to tell him since the courtyard. He decided, immediately, not to think about it. They rode south 4 days later, and someone tried to end it on the 2nd night. The camp was quiet. Nora was awake anyway, because she had not slept properly since the buried hall, and so she heard the tent flap move. She did not scream. She rolled off the pallet into the dark on the far side, and the figure that came through went straight past her, fast and certain, and by the time it turned around, she was already out under the canvas at the back, with her heart going like a hammer. She hit the cold air, took 2 steps, and Corin came out of the dark like a hill deciding to move. He did not touch the man. He simply stood over the tent, and the intruder came out with his hands up and his weapon thrown away, shaking so hard he could not stand. They questioned him for an hour. He was a hired sword from the river towns. He had never seen the man who paid him. He had been given a purse, a description of a thin, dark-haired girl, and one instruction, delivered by a servant in plain clothes at an inn. It must happen before she reaches the capital. Edward went very still at that. "Before she reaches the capital," he repeated. "Not before she reaches me, not on the road. Before she reaches the capital." "It means nothing," said Simon Crane, who had ridden out to meet them and had said almost nothing since he first laid eyes on Corin. "Half the North wants her dead. She frightens them." "Half the North did not know she existed 9 days ago," Edward said. Crane smiled and let it go, and Nora watched him let it go, and filed the moment away. The capital was called Hallowmere, and it did not want her. She saw that inside the first hour. The city turned out to stare at Corin, thousands of them packed onto rooftops and walls in complete silence, and the silence was not respect. It was the quiet of people watching a storm come over the hills toward their houses. The court was worse. The great hall of Hallowmere held 200 nobles, and every one of them had spent the 4 days of the ride deciding what she was. She was a witch. She was a fraud. She was a Ravenmore weapon. She was a common servant, with a trained animal and a talent for theater. Lord this and Lady that stood up one after another and said these things out loud while she stood in the middle of the floor in a borrowed dress with her hands folded, and she said absolutely nothing, because she had 11 years of practice at exactly this. Diana Frost had come south too. Of course she had. She said the cleverest thing of the afternoon, which was not to attack Nora at all. "I only wonder," she said sweetly, "what happens to us the day the girl becomes angry? She has every reason to be. We were all standing in that courtyard. That landed." Nora watched it land on 200 faces at once. "Enough," Edward said. "My king, it is a fair question. It is a frightened one." He came down 2 steps of the dais. "You want to know if she will turn the 9 on us. Ask her." The hall looked at Nora. She lifted her head and spoke for the 2nd time in public in her life. "They do not come when I am angry," she said. "If they did, this hall would already be gone. They come when I call, and I have called once, and it cost me more than any of you will ever pay for anything." Nobody had a follow-up question. The nights, though, were hers. Hallowmere had an archive under the West Tower, 400 years of records in a room that smelled of dust and mice, and the keeper was an ancient man named Owen Price, who had not had a visitor in 6 years and nearly wept when 2 of them arrived at once. Nora and Martha went down there every night for 3 weeks. They were looking for one winter, 21 years back, 9 days in the deep cold, and a plague that the Crown had recorded and that Martha Doyle swore on her life had never existed. The first thing they found was that the year was missing. Not damaged, not lost, removed, cleanly, the way a careful man removes a page. The tax rolls jumped from one year to the next. The muster list skipped it. The court diary had a gap of 14 months and a note in the margin, in a clerk's tidy hand, saying the volumes had been withdrawn for safekeeping. "Withdrawn by whom?" Nora asked. Owen Price peered at the ledger with a candle. "There is a seal here, faded." Martha put out her hand. "Let me." The old blind woman ran her fingertips over the wax for a long, long time. "A hawk," she said quietly. "A hawk over 3 stones." Nora had been living in Hallowmere for 3 weeks. She had walked past that crest 100 times a day. It was above the doors of the West Wing, on the banners in the yard, on the ring the warlord wore on his right hand, the crest of the house that had held the regency for 8 years while a boy king grew up. "Crane," she said. They went carefully after that. It took another 11 nights, and it came together out of small, dull things, the way real truth usually does. A supply requisition for 80 horses in a month, when there was supposedly no army moving. A pay roster, with 60 names and no unit listed. A letter from a border reeve asking why armed riders in no colors had passed through his district 3 nights running, and a reply, over the regent's seal, instructing him to stop writing letters. And then, at the very bottom of a crate that had been mislabeled since before Nora was born, a single list. 14 family names. Beside each one, a village. Beside each village, a date. The dates ran across 9 days. Nora sat on the floor of the archive with that list in her hands and looked at the 7th line, where a name she had never seen written down before sat beside the village of Fellbarrow and the 8th day of that winter. Her mother's name. "He did not do it for the crown," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her. The king was 9 years old. This was not a king's order. "No," said Martha. "It was a regent's." "Why?" "Because a moonspeaker can wake a judge," Martha said, "and a man who intends to spend the rest of his life being obeyed cannot afford a judge. Not one, not ever." Nora went to Edward that night, and she got as far as his door. She never got the words out, because Simon Crane had reached him first, and Crane had spent 21 years preparing for a night like this one. 9 days earlier, a young warrior of the Royal Guard named Isaac Ward had gone missing from a border patrol. It had barely been noted. Border patrols lost men. He was found the same evening Nora came up from the archive, out beyond the eastern wall, and the men who found him came back white-faced, and the story went through Hallowmere before midnight and reached every corner of it by dawn. He had been killed by something enormous. The ground around him was torn. There were tracks in the frozen mud, and they were the size of dinner plates. And there was only one creature in the northern reaches that made a track like that. And there was a witness. A carter, shaking and honest and completely convinced, who swore before the whole court that he had seen a great gray wolf on that ground at dusk 2 nights running, and that the girl had been out walking alone both of those nights, which was true, because she had been in the archive, and the archive was a secret she could not explain without accusing the second most powerful man in the kingdom of murdering 14 families. Crane did not accuse her. That was the craft of it. He defended her. He stood up in the great hall with his hands open and grief on his face, and he said that no one should rush to judgment, that the creature was ancient, and perhaps not fully in the girl's control, that this was surely an accident, that the beast had simply followed its nature. He said it kindly, he said it 3 times, and with every kind word he drove the nail deeper, because a defense like that leaves nothing standing. By noon, the hall wanted her chained. By evening, the city wanted her gone. And Edward Hale stood between the woman he had wronged and the man who had raised him, and he had a court in open panic, and a war he was losing on his eastern border, and a dead boy of 19, laid out under a white cloth, and he had to choose. Nora watched him choose. She saw the exact moment. She was standing in the middle of the floor, where they always made her stand, and she looked up at him and said, clearly, in front of everyone, I did not do this, and neither did he. Ask me anything you want, and I will answer it. Where were you those nights? Crane said instantly. In the archive under the West Tower. Reading what? And there it was. The trap, laid perfectly. Because the true answer was a list of 14 murdered families and a seal shaped like a hawk over 3 stones, and the moment she said it out loud in that hall, in front of a court that already believed she was a liar, it would be the desperate invention of a cornered servant girl. It would destroy the only proof she had. It would put Martha and old Owen Price in reach. So Nora Blake, who had learned at 7 years old that silence cost less, made the worst decision of her life. She said, I cannot tell you that yet. The hall exhaled. Chain the animal, Edward said. Corin could not be chained. 40 men with a cart of iron went out to the field where he lay, and the great wolf watched them come, and something in the air went so heavy that horses sat down. Corin did not move. He looked at Nora across the field, and she understood him perfectly. He would tear that city apart for her. All she had to do was say the word. If she said it, every fear in that hall became the truth, and the 9 became exactly the monsters the old histories had lied about, and the men who buried them 300 years ago would have been right after all. Go, she said to him. Go back under the hill, please. And Corin turned and walked north, and the sound of the whole city breathing out again was the loneliest thing she had ever heard. They put her in the courtyard. Not a cell. Crane suggested the courtyard, and he made it sound like mercy, because the cells were cold, and the yard had sun in the afternoon. It was the yard where the king's household gathered. It was the yard where the water carts came in. It was, precisely and deliberately, a yard, and everyone who passed through it saw a thin, dark-haired girl sitting against a stone wall with a chain on her wrists, exactly as they had once seen her on her knees in a puddle at Ironcrest. Edward came down at midnight. He stood in front of her for a long time without speaking, and she did not help him. Tell me what you were reading, he said finally. No, Nora. It was the first time he had used her name. Give me one thing, one name, one page, anything at all, and I will pull this apart myself, and I will not stop until it is finished. I am asking you. She looked up at him, and for a moment, one single moment, she nearly did it. Then she looked past his shoulder, up at the covered walk on the second floor, where a big man with silver at his temples was standing perfectly still in the dark, watching them both. Ask the man behind you, she said quietly, what he did in the winter you turned 9. Edward turned. The walk was empty. Under the northern hills, in a hall of black stone, 8 sealed doors began, very softly, to crack. The first rider came in at dawn with his horse half dead under him. The second came an hour later. The third did not bother with the gate and shouted his message up from the road, and by then it did not matter, because the people on the north wall of Hallowmere could see it for themselves. The hills were moving. 8 shapes had come down out of the high country in the night, and they were crossing the open farmland shoulder to shoulder, in a line a mile wide, and they were not hurrying. That was what emptied the city, not speed. They came at a steady, patient, unstoppable walk, the way weather comes, and every field they crossed went silent behind them, and every wolf inside the walls of Hallowmere could feel them arriving in the bones of their own legs. The gates were shut. Nobody pretended that would help. Nora was still chained in the courtyard when the panic reached it. She heard the bells. She heard the running. She heard a captain of the guard shouting orders that made no sense, and a woman somewhere above her crying, and she got to her feet with the chain dragging, and she understood exactly what was happening. The 9 had heard her speak once. Then they had felt her put in irons. They had not come to obey her. They had come to collect her, and they were going to walk through a city of 40,000 people to do it. Get me up on the wall, she said. Nobody listened. Get me up on the wall." Edward heard that. He came across the courtyard at a run, and he did not stop to argue with the guard captain, and he did not send for a key. He put his hands on the chain where it was bolted to the stone, and he tore it out of the wall. "Can you stop them?" "I do not know." "Can you try?" "Yes." They took her up the north tower 2 steps at a time, with the chain still hanging from her wrists, and when she came out onto the top of the wall, the whole of Hallowmere saw her, and the whole of Hallowmere went quiet. 8 of the oldest things in the world were 400 yards out and closing. Nora Blake put her hands on the cold stone of the wall, and she looked down at them, and she called out one word. "Stop." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The word went out over the fields like a stone dropped into still water, and 8 enormous shapes came to a halt so completely and so instantly that the ground shook once with the weight of it, and 40,000 people on the walls of Hallowmere made a sound like a single held breath letting go. Then Nora's legs went out from under her. Edward caught her before she hit the stone. Her nose was bleeding. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not close them, and when he pushed her hair back from her face, he saw the mark, dark red and spreading up the side of her throat like a burn that had grown there in 3 seconds. What is this? He was not calm. He had been calm through 2 wars, and he was not calm now. Somebody get the physicians. What is happening to her? "That," said Martha Doyle from the stairwell, "is the price." They put Nora in a room in the east tower with the shutters open so she could see north, and Martha sat by the bed and finally said the thing she had been carrying alone for a month. "A moon speaker does not command the 9, she said. "Nobody commands the 9. What she does is spend herself. Every word she gives them is paid for out of her own life, 1 word at a time, and the bigger the word, the bigger the price, and there is no way to earn any of it back." Edward stood by the window with his back to the room. "How many words does she have?" "There is no number written anywhere. Some had 100, some had 9. Martha's hands were folded very tightly in her lap. Her mother had 1 left at the end, and she used it, and I have never told anyone what it was." "What was it?" "Run," Martha said. She said it to the ones who came for her. It was the 8th night of that winter. They ran 40 miles, and 2 of them never stopped running, and she died on the dead ground with a baby in her arms, and that was all she had. The room was very quiet. "I mocked her in a courtyard," Edward said, "in front of 40 people, for the crime of spilling water on my boots." "Yes," said Martha, "you did." Simon Crane took the throne room at the 11th hour of that same night, and he did it without a single blade being drawn, because he had spent 21 years making sure he would not need one. The doors of the Great Hall were held by men of the Royal Guard. Those men had been picked, promoted, and paid by the warlord since before the king could read. The captains of the West and South Gates had ridden with Crane for 2 decades. The commander of the household troop owed him a debt no one else knew about, and had owed it for 11 years, which is a very long time to wait to be asked for payment. By midnight, every door in Hallowmere that mattered opened for Simon Crane and nobody else. And at midnight, through the eastern gate, in good order and in perfect silence, came 400 warriors of the Ravenmore packs. Edward came down into his own throne room to find his own guards standing along the walls with their eyes fixed on nothing, and his enemies standing at ease under his banners, and the man who had raised him sitting on the arm of the throne with one leg swinging like a boy on a fence. "There he is," Crane said warmly. "Come in. Sit down. You look tired." "Ravenmore," Edward said. "Ravenmore has been mine since the spring of the year you turned 21. Crane spread his hands. The raids, the burnings, the 4 holds in 11 days. All of it mine, and all of it in your name, and all of it designed to make one thing perfectly obvious to every noble house in the north. That, I cannot hold the border. That, the boy cannot hold the border," Crane corrected gently. "There is a difference, and the difference is the whole point. I ruled this kingdom for 8 years, Edward. I ruled it well. Then a child with the right surname turned 17, and I handed him a crown, and I stood behind a chair for 12 more years and smiled. You could have taken it at any time. Not cleanly. And I do everything cleanly." Crane stood. "So here is the offer, and it is a good one. Kneel. Rule as my voice. You keep the throne, the banners, the songs, and I keep the decisions. Nobody dies. The border quiets down within a month, because I will simply tell it to, and the North gets 30 years of peace. And if I refuse, then you die badly in a war you were losing, Crane said, and the North mourns you sincerely, and I take the crown with wet eyes and a heavy heart, and in 11 months nobody will remember there was ever a question. Edward looked at the men along the walls. Not one of them looked back. 21 years ago, he said, you sent riders in no colors into 14 villages. Crane did not flinch. He did not even look surprised. He looked, if anything, a little pleased, the way a teacher looks when a slow student finally gets to the end of the problem. I did. Say it out loud. Why? So you can feel something? Crane came down the steps. Yes, I did it. 14 families in 9 days, and I have never lost an hour of sleep over it. And I will tell you exactly why. Because I read the old records before I burned them, and I know what the 9 are, which is more than your ancestors ever bothered to learn. They are not weapons. Weapons I could have used. They are judges, and they come when a certain kind of throat calls them, and when they come, they open a man up and read him out in front of everyone he has ever lied to. And you could not have that. No man who intends to hold power for 30 years can have that. Crane's voice never rose. I did not do it out of cruelty. I did it out of arithmetic. 14 families, against a kingdom that finally holds still. That is a good trade, and I would make it again this evening. You murdered her mother. I have murdered a great many people's mothers, Crane said. This one is only interesting because you have gone soft over the daughter, which I confess I did not plan for, and which has been an enormous nuisance. Then he raised one hand, and 2 men brought Martha Doyle in through the side door. She was walking on her own. Her chin was up, and she was not making a sound, and her thin wrists were bound in front of her, and Edward heard himself say something he could not afterwards remember. Now, said Crane, we can stop pretending. The 9 will not answer me. I accepted that a long time ago. But they answer her, and she answers this old woman, and so in the end, everything answers me after all. He looked toward the doors. Bring the girl. She will want to hear the terms herself. They brought Nora down at the point of 2 spears, still in the plain gray dress, still with the mark burning up the side of her throat. She saw Martha bound. She saw the Ravenmoor warriors under her king's banners. She saw the guards along the wall who would not meet anyone's eye, and Simon Crane standing on the steps of the throne in complete comfort, and she took the whole thing in without a flicker, because she had spent 11 years reading rooms she was not allowed to speak in. Here are the terms, Crane said. You will send the 8 back under their hill. You will go down there with them, and you will be sealed in, and I will have the entrance broken and buried, and the old woman will live out her years in a warm cottage with a garden, on my word, which as far as you know is worth something. And if I say no, then I will do all of it anyway, minus the garden. Nora looked at Edward. And Edward Hale, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, did something that no one in that hall, on any side of it, had prepared for. He walked into the middle of the floor, in front of 400 enemy warriors and 200 of his own traitors, and the man who had raised him, and he went down on both knees in front of a servant girl. The room made a noise. Crane's face changed for the first time. Get up, Crane said. Edward, get up. Edward did not get up. 6 weeks ago, he said, and his voice carried, because he had been trained since childhood to make his voice carry in that hall. I stood in a courtyard at Ironcrest, and I mocked a woman who had done nothing to me. I said she had no soul worth naming. 40 people laughed because I laughed first, and that is what a king is, and I knew it when I said it. This is not the moment, Crane said. Then I let her be put out of a gate to freeze, Edward went on, and then I let her be chained in my own yard, where every servant in this house could walk past and look at her. And I did all of it, because it was easier than asking one difficult question about the man standing behind my chair. He looked up at her. I am not saying this because it will save me. It will not. I am saying it because it is owed, and I may not have another chance to pay it. I was wrong, Nora Blake. You were the only honest person in that courtyard, and I made a joke of you to make 200 cowards comfortable. I am sorry, not sorry that it cost me, sorry that it happened to you. Nobody in that hall breathed. Nora crossed the floor, and the 2 spears did not stop her because the men holding them had entirely forgotten what they were for. She stood in front of the kneeling king, and she reached down and took his hands, and she pulled him up onto his feet. "I accept it," she said quietly. "Now stand up, because I need you to hear something, and there is no time." She leaned close, so that only he could hear, and her voice was steady and almost gentle. "I have somewhere around 12 words left in me," she said. "That is what is left of my whole life. Count it out loud. He has 400 warriors, 200 of your own men, this city, both gates, and Martha." Edward looked at her. "Then we had better choose the 12 very carefully," he said. She spent the first of the 12 in that hall, and she spent it well. "Come." The word went out through the stone and under the city and across 4 miles of frozen farmland, and it found something old lying in the dark beyond the northern hills that had been waiting 6 weeks to be asked. The eastern wall of the great hall of Hallowmere came in. It did not crack or crumble. It simply stopped being a wall, and where it had been, there was a shoulder the color of storm cloud, and then a head, and then 2 enormous eyes looking calmly down the length of the throne room at Simon Crane. 400 Ravenmoor warriors went out of that hall by every door and window it had, and a fair number made new ones. In the noise, 3 things happened in about 9 seconds. Edward got a spear off one of his own frozen guards and put himself between Nora and the steps. Crane, who had never in his life panicked and did not start then, took 2 fast strides sideways, got a hand on Martha Doyle's bound wrists, and pulled the old woman back through the side door with 3 of his captains around him like a wall. And Diana Frost, who had spent the entire evening standing very quietly at the edge of the room in silver-gray wool, watched him go and made a decision that surprised her more than anybody. She followed him. By the time Edward reached the side door, it was barred from the other side. By the time they got it open, Crane was on the north road with 40 riders, and the old blind woman was on a horse in front of one of his captains, and the direction they were riding was not the direction of any safety in the world. They were riding for the hollow. "Of course he is," Nora said. "He needs the entrance." "Explain." "He cannot beat the 9, and he knows it, so he is going to do exactly what his ancestors did." She was already moving. "He will bury the stair. He will break the hall, and fill it, and salt it. And if he can do that, while Martha is standing in front of him, then either I go down there and let myself be sealed in, or I watch." Edward was shouting for horses before she finished the sentence. They rode north in the dark, with everything Hallowmere could still put on a saddle, which was less than it should have been, and more than Crane expected. Because Crane had made one mistake, and it was the same mistake he had made 21 years before, and it was this. He believed that the people who follow a powerful man are the same thing as the people who belong to him. 200 of the royal guard had stood along the walls of that throne room, with their eyes fixed on nothing. By dawn, 160 of them were riding north behind their king, because a wall coming in has a way of clarifying a man's loyalties, and because a 19-year-old named Isaac Ward had been one of theirs, and the story of who had actually put him in that field was going through the ranks like fire through dry grass. They caught Crane at the edge of the hollow with the sun coming up. He had his 40 riders and the 400 of Ravenmoor strung out across the dead ground, and he had wagons of stone and timber already at the head of the stair, and he had Martha Doyle standing at the top of those steps with a captain's hand on her arm. And in the fields 3 miles south, 8 enormous shapes that had been standing perfectly still since a girl on a wall told them to stop, turned their heads north. "Second word," Nora said. "Follow." The ground shook, and the 8 came. What happened on the hollow that morning was told for 200 years afterwards, and almost all of the tellings got it wrong, because almost all of them made it into a slaughter. It was not one. The 8 came onto the dead ground in a line, and 400 warriors of Ravenmoor looked at what was coming toward them and remembered, all at once and all together, that they were farmers and hunters and second sons who had been promised land in the south. Most of them put down their weapons where they stood. A great many of them ran. Nobody blamed them. The fighting that did happen was between men. Crane's 40 were his own, 20 years of them, and they knew exactly what they had signed for. They held the head of the stair, and Edward's 160 came at them across open stone, with no cover and no clever ground, and it was hard and fast and ugly in the plain way that such things are. Edward went straight up the middle. He was not fighting like a king protecting a claim. "Nora," running behind the line with the chain marks still on her wrists, saw the difference clearly, and it frightened her more than the 8 did. Halfway up the slope, one of Crane's captains came at his blind side. "Down," Nora said. Third word. Edward dropped flat without knowing why, and the blow went over him and into empty air, and Corin's head came down out of the sky, and the captain went from the field entirely, and Nora tasted blood again, and put a hand on the stone until the ground stopped tilting. 9 left. The 8 reached the line then, and this was the moment the tellings always got wrong. They came in among the Ravenmoor men, who had thrown down their weapons, 400 of them kneeling or lying flat on the cold rock with their hands over their heads, and the 8 looked down at them the way weather looks down at a field. Nora saw it. She understood what was one breath away from happening. Hold. Fourth word, and it was the one that cost her most so far, because it was not a small thing to ask 8 ancient judges to stand over 400 enemies and do nothing at all. They stopped. They stood there, 8 shapes the size of hills, over 400 men who had ridden in that morning to help bury a girl, and they did not touch a single one of them, and every one of those 400 lived to tell their grandchildren about it. 8 words left. Nora's ears were ringing, and there was a taste in her mouth like old coins, and she wiped her face with the back of her hand and kept walking up the slope toward the stair. Crane was waiting at the top, with the last of his captains, and one old blind woman. "Far enough," he said. She stopped 6 paces below him. He looked terrible in the morning light, which was the first satisfying thing Nora had seen all day. The calm was still there, but it was stretched thin over the top of something, the way ice sits on a pond in the first week of spring. "You will send them back under the hill," he said, "and you will go with them, and this ends here with everyone else alive. That was the offer last night, and it is still the offer now. I keep my word. That is the one thing about me that has always been true, and you know it is, or you would not still be standing there listening. Let her go, and I will talk to you about it." No. Then Diana Frost stepped out from behind the third wagon, with her hair coming down, and her silver wool ruined to the knee, and she cut the rope on Martha Doyle's wrists with a small knife, and shoved the old woman hard down the steps into Nora's arms. Nobody had noticed her. Nobody ever noticed the pretty daughter of a border house, who had been standing at the edge of the room all evening. Diana Frost had spent her whole life being decorative, and it turned out to be the most useful skill on that hill. Crane's captain turned on her, with his arm coming up. "Free," said Nora. Fifth word, and it did not mean what anyone expected. Corin came up the steps in a single movement, and the captain simply found that there was nothing near him any more to hold, and Diana went down onto the stone on her hands and knees, alive, shaking, and looking up at Nora with an expression that was going to take her about 10 years to work out. 7 words left, and Simon Crane, who had run out of soldiers, hostages, and time in the space of 9 minutes, drew the blade at his hip. "Then let us at least be honest about what this is," he said. "Come up here, girl." "No," said Edward Hale, arriving at the top of the slope with his 160 behind him. "I will." "You?" Crane laughed, and it was almost fond. "Edward, I taught you every guard you know. I know which shoulder you drop when you are tired. I have known since you were 11. "I know," Edward said. "That is why I am not going to fight you." He turned and looked at Nora, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with words at all. "Do it," he said. Nora walked up the last 6 steps and stood in front of the man who had ordered 14 villages emptied in 9 days, and she looked up into his face, and she spent the 6th of her words. "Judge." The hollow went quiet. Corin came up out of the stairwell behind her, and the other 8 turned as one from the field below and began to walk in, closing a circle around the head of that stair. 9 ancient things that 300 years of kings had lied about because the truth was too expensive. Crane raised the blade. He did not use it. There was nothing to use it on. Corin lowered his enormous head until his eyes were level with a man's, and he looked into Simon Crane, and then he began to speak, and everyone on that hill heard it in their own heads at once. It was not an accusation. There was no anger in it anywhere. That was what made it unbearable. It was a list. 14 family names, every one of them, spoken slowly, in the order they had been given to riders in no colors, on a piece of paper 21 years ago, the village beside each name, the date beside each village, the number of people in each house, which nobody in the world had counted, and which the 9 somehow knew. Then it went on. It named the Reeve, who had written 3 letters and had been told to stop writing letters, and what had happened to him in the spring. It named the boy Isaac Ward, 19 years old, and told the hill exactly how he had come to be lying in a field beyond the eastern wall, and whose order it had been, and that the tracks in the mud had been pressed there by a cartwheel and a carved wooden shape made in a workshop in the lower town. It named the man who had carved it and the sum he had been paid. It named the 400 of Ravenmoor, kneeling on the stone below, and told them, in plain words, what had actually been promised to them, and what had actually been planned for them once the border was quiet. 400 men on the cold rock heard the truth about themselves and their own dead, and the sound they made was not a battle cry. It was much worse than that. It went on for a long time. Crane stood in the middle of it with his blade in his hand, and the 9 did not touch him once. His own captains put their weapons down first, then his 40. Then the men from Ravenmoor came up the slope, and Edward's 160 stepped aside and let them through, because there was nothing in the world that was going to stop them, and no reason on earth to try. Simon Crane was not killed by his enemies that morning. He was condemned by his own people, out loud, in daylight, in front of every soul on that hill, and that is the only kind of ending that actually ends anything. A man cut down by a king becomes a story about a wronged man. A man handed the list of his own deeds and left standing in it becomes nothing at all, which is exactly what he had spent 21 years making sure other people became. Nora did not watch. She had gone to sit on the top step with Martha Doyle's head in her lap, and she was shaking all over, and there was blood on her mouth, and the mark on her throat had gone up past her jaw. 6 words left. Then Corin turned from the head of the stair and came to her, and told her the price of the last thing that still had to be done. The barrows were open. All 9 of them, 8 cracked from the inside, and the 9th thrown wide, and the doors of a thing like that do not simply swing shut because the trouble is finished. The 9 were awake in the world for the first time in 300 years, and they were judges, and judgment does not stop being hungry once it has started. They would go south, not out of anger, out of nature. They would walk into every hall and every village and every kitchen in the northern reaches, and they would read every living soul out loud in front of everyone that soul had ever lied to, and there is no person alive who survives that, and no marriage, and no friendship, and no town. A world under permanent judgment is not a world anybody can live in. They had to be sealed, and the seal, Corin told her, is not made of stone. Stone was only what the old kings had used because they had nothing better. A true seal is made of a moonspeaker's voice. All of it, down to the last breath. And that is what the word costs. Her mother had died holding a line with the last word she had. Nora would die closing a door with hers. Then get on with it, Nora said, and started to stand up. Edward got there first. He came down onto the step in front of her and took her face in both hands, and for the first time since she had met him, the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches could not put 2 words together at all. There has to be another way to do this. There is not. Then we leave them open. We take the risk. We go somewhere, we go north, we go across the water, we go anywhere at all, and we let the North sort out its own lies for once. You do not mean that. I mean it entirely, he said, and she could see that he did, and that was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Nora Blake, who had been laughed at by 40 people in a courtyard, who had been put out of a gate to freeze, who had been chained in a yard where the water carts came in, looked up at a man who was ready to hand her a whole kingdom's ruin rather than let her go, and understood that she had been loved for approximately 11 minutes and was now going to have to stop. 6 words, she said. That is all I have. It is more than my mother had. She stood up, and Corin, who had been buried for 300 years by men who feared being measured, put his enormous head down beside her and said the thing that changed the ending. They buried us, he said, because we came when we were called. Nora stopped. I know, she said. You told me that. It is written on the stone. 9 houses called us down into a hall and sealed the doors, said Corin. And in 300 years, in all the years before that, in every hall, and every field and every winter, Out of every throat that ever carried the voice, not one of them ever asked. They ordered. They summoned, they commanded, and they were obeyed, and every command was paid for in life, and it never once occurred to any of them, not to the kings, not to the houses, not even to your mother on the 8th night, that a thing which is asked will sometimes simply say yes. Nora stood on the top step of a buried hall with the sun coming up over the dead ground, and she began, very quietly, to laugh, and then to cry, and then to do both at once. She turned around and looked at the 9. She did not lift her chin. She did not use the voice that had stopped 8 of them dead in a field, a mile from the walls of Hallowmere. She put her hands out, palms up, the way you hold them out to something you are not certain will come, and she asked, "Please," she said, "rest." And they went. They went willingly, the way tired people go to bed, 9 ancient things walking one by one down into the dark of their own hall. And Corin went last, and he stopped at the bottom of the stair and looked back up at her for a long moment before the black stone closed over the top of him without a hand touching it. The hollow sealed itself in perfect silence, and because the covenant had been freely given instead of spent, the price did not fall where it had always fallen before. Nora Blake did not die on that hill. She simply never spoke again. The physicians could find nothing wrong with her. Her throat was whole. The mark faded over a month and left clean skin behind. She could laugh, and she could cry out if she was startled, and she could hum, badly, which Martha Doyle claimed was a mercy for everyone. But the words were gone, all of them, down to the last, and they did not come back. A year later, on the first warm day of spring, the North gathered at Hallowmere for a wedding that half the noble houses had loudly predicted would never happen and quietly practiced speeches for. Edward Hale had spent that year doing 3 things. He had put down what was left of the Eastern Trouble, which took 11 weeks and no burned villages, because it turned out that 400 men, who have heard the truth about who was going to be sacrificed for whose ambition, make excellent witnesses and unenthusiastic rebels. He had abolished the choosing, in the 2nd month, by simple proclamation, on the grounds that no daughter of any house should ever again be lined up in a courtyard and looked over like a horse at market. Diana Frost, who was by then the youngest member of his council and an extremely difficult person to argue with, wrote the proclamation herself and made it considerably ruder than he had intended. And he had learned to speak with his hands. He learned it from an old blind woman who had taught it 40 years before to a deaf child in a border village, and he learned it badly at first, and then quickly, and then very well, and he did it in 3 months, in the evenings, after full days of holding a kingdom together, because it did not once occur to him that there was any other option. So the North got a queen who signed her decrees and never made a speech, and the North, to its considerable surprise, got used to her fast, because it turned out that a ruler who cannot talk over people listens to them, and that a court that has to watch a woman's hands to understand her ends up watching her rather closely, and finds out that she misses nothing at all. Once a season, the 2 of them ride north on their own. They leave the guards at the tree line, because the horses will not go any further anyway, and they walk out together onto the wide bare bowl of black stone, where the snow still does not settle properly. There is grass now at the edges, thin and stubborn, which nobody can explain. She kneels in the middle of it. She puts her palm flat on the cold black rock. She does not say anything, because she has nothing left to say, and has not needed it for a long time. And under the stone, under 300 years of lies and 1 honest morning, 9 ancient voices answer her anyway. Not a crown, not a king, not a bloodline, or a banner, or a house with a hawk over 3 stones. They answer the quiet one, in the torn dress, with the bare feet, that a courtyard, full of people once laughed at, because nobody thought she was worth the trouble of learning her name,